Okay, let's look at the neurologic control of your respirations. Now, when we look at this picture here in front of us, we can see that your primary region for control of respirations is going to be centered predominantly around the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is roughly located in this region, okay? That's going to be the medulla oblongata. Now, specifically within the medulla oblongata, we are going to have, and you can see here, these are two different orange regions that's in this picture. Those two different regions are given different names. There's a ventral respiratory group, which is also abbreviated VRG. So ventral respiratory group, and that's going to be the front one. And the one on the back side is dorsal respiratory group, just abbreviated DRG, and that's going to be the back side of this one, okay? So let me just get rid of some of these colors here. So what we're going to be looking at is this is the region that is controlling inhaling or exhaling. So now what is it doing? So respiration, or inhaling and exhaling, as we know from the previous video, is controlled by, for inhalation, is controlled by the diaphragm and your external intercostals. For inspiration, or let's just limit it to quiet breathing right now, okay? Let's not bring in the accessory muscles. But for quiet breathing, you've got the diaphragm and you have your external intercostals. Those muscles are innervated by your phrenic nerve that goes to the diaphragm. Now remember, this was going back last semester, I believe, where we, it might have been this semester, where we talked about the brachial plexus and which nerves form the phrenic nerve, okay? Well, that goes to the diaphragm. And as you can see on here, that's coming down this direction and going that way, okay? The other nerve that innervates the other muscles are going to be the intercostal nerves between the ribs, and that's going to be coming down in those directions, okay? So those are the intercostal nerves that's going to innervate the external intercostal muscles. So let's look at one other thing here. Breathing is based on levels of certain chemicals within your blood or your cerebral spinal fluid, okay? The nerve endings that are sensitive to chemical changes are called chemoreceptors. So chemoreceptors are those neurons that are sensitive to some kind of a chemical change. Now, in your central chemoreceptor, so the chemoreceptors part of your central nervous system, there's going to be chemoreceptors in the peripheral nervous system. So let's first look at the central chemoreceptors. And those are going to be located in the medulla oblongata, and they're essentially going to be looking at or sensitive to hydrogen ions, and specifically hydrogen ions in your cerebral spinal fluid. Secondarily, that's going to be associated with carbon dioxide. We'll get into how indirectly that's carbon dioxide, but more specifically, the chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata are going to be sensitive for hydrogen ions. The peripheral chemoreceptors, those are going to be located in your aortic arch, as well as, okay, so you have your common carotids going up in this direction, and you can see where the common carotid splits off into internal and external carotids. Right at that bifurcation, that area is known as your carotid bodies, and there's chemoreceptors there as well. Those carotid bodies are sensitive for hydrogen ions, as well as partial pressure of carbon dioxide. I mentioned partial pressure right now. We haven't talked about it yet. I'll talk about that in upcoming videos. But more specifically, it's related to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Thirdly, they can be receptive to or sensitive to partial pressure of oxygen, but that has to be in large changes of the partial pressure of oxygen in your blood. So when you get into pathology, when you're looking at COPD, emphysema, and what is regulating your breathing, we're looking at carbon dioxide levels, hydrogen ion, those sort of things. Later on, it's going to be oxygen levels, okay? So let's look at real briefly on how you're breathing at this point. So we're just limiting it on quiet breathing right now. So in quiet breathing, we have your ventral respiratory group. So this one is in the front, okay? This area here. That sends an efferent signal out, and it's going to go down out here. It's going to go down to through the phrenic nerve and intercostal nerves to stimulate those muscles to contract. When they contract, it elongates and expands your thoracic cavity, so you inhale, but it's sending a signal to inhale for approximately 2 seconds. At the same time of its inhaling or contracting, and it's sending the signal for 2 seconds, simultaneously it is turning off other neurons. So let me break this down a little bit more. Think of two different type of neurons in your ventral respiratory group. There's inspiratory neurons, and then there's expiratory neurons. So those neurons that are, their job is to send a signal to inhale, and then there are those neurons that basically say, okay, those muscles for inhaling, you guys can now relax, okay? So when we are sending a signal from your inspiratory neurons of your ventral respiratory group, it sends a signal down, goes to the phrenic nerve, intercostal nerves, and it sends a signal for about 2 seconds. That is causing the inhalation. Simultaneously, it is sending the ventral group, also the inspiratory neurons, are sending a signal to the expiratory neurons, those neurons that allow for exhaling, and it's basically turning them off. So the inspiratory neurons are turned on. It tells the expiratory neurons to turn off. After 2 seconds, okay, after we send that efferent signal for 2 seconds, the expiratory neurons of the ventral respiratory group basically turns off the inspiratory neurons. So we're kind of going back and forth like this. So you inhale for 2 seconds, the inspiratory neurons sends a signal down to the phrenic nerve, intercostal nerves, simultaneously turns off the expiratory neurons for 2 seconds. When you exhale, the expiratory neurons sends a signal saying, okay, diaphragm, okay, intercostal muscles, you can relax now. So now you're going to start exhaling, but it's simultaneously of telling those muscles to relax, it tells your inspiratory neurons to turn off. So here in one hand, if this is inspiratory neurons and this is active, it's telling the expiratory neurons to turn off. So you inhale, they kind of go like this. Inhale, it's turning this one off. Exhale, this one turns this one off, okay? But you exhale, the inhalation is for 2 seconds, exhalation is for 3 seconds. So 2 inhale, 3 out. And this works out to be about, for a resting breathing rate, about 12 respirations per minute, 12 to 15 respirations per minute. So that's what we're looking at on here. The other area is going to be the pons. Briefly, I'm going to look at this. This is not controlling inhaling or exhaling. The pons, or more specifically this pinker area, That's your pontine respiratory center. And what that is doing is it's regulating smooth transitions between inhaling and exhaling. So you can see this signal coming down, and it's going to your dorsal respiratory groups, ventral respiratory groups. And what it's doing is allowing for a smooth transition between inhaling and exhaling. So it's not so jerky of a motion, okay? Now I said that the ventral and dorsal respiratory groups are going to be sensitive to hydrogen ions in your central nervous system or your cerebral spinal fluid. If you recall, let me do this in blue. Let me do this in this color blue, okay? What is located in this region that I'm drawing down here, okay? You should know what this space is. You should also know what occupies that space. And if you're thinking cerebral spinal fluid, you are correct. But notice the proximity of the cerebral spinal fluid to your dorsal respiratory group. That's where the chemoreceptors are for your central nervous system or for breathing. Okay, so now let's look at how your body can alter its breathing pattern by autonomic reflexes. So we've talked about reflexes in the past. This is just another version of that, and they're stimulated by the chemoreceptors. Now there's other ones we'll talk about as well, but I want to focus in on the chemoreceptors. So when we look at the chemoreceptors, we said they were in two different locations. One is central chemoreceptors, which are going to be associated with the central nervous system and are found in your medulla oblongata, specifically your dorsal respiratory group. Let me put this back as black on this one. Okay, so that's going to be your dorsal respiratory group area in this area because it's noticing or it's picking up the hydrogen ion concentration in your cerebral spinal fluid. So what happens in this cases is those receptors will initiate a reflex, which then communicates with the ventral respiratory group. So let's look at the difference. How do you change the rate of respiration? So we talked about earlier, for quiet breathing, there's 2 seconds of inhalation, 3 seconds of exhalation. To adjust the rate, that ventral respiratory group then decreases that time frame. So instead of 2 seconds inhalation, let's say it's 1 second inhalation, and instead of 3 exhale, we do 2 exhale. So you can see we're putting it closer together, which then increases the rate. The ventral respiratory group also controls the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerves. Well, to alter the depth of breathing, the ventral respiratory group sends a signal to then stimulate the accessory muscles that are part of breathing as well, which would then increase the depth of breathing. So let's look at what the chemoreceptors are doing and how it's controlling this. Now we've said that the central chemoreceptors located in the dorsal respiratory group of the medulla oblongata. Okay, now follow along on the pictures on this one. So the chemoreceptors of the dorsal respiratory group of the medulla oblongata are sensitive to hydrogen ion concentration, secondarily the PCO2 distally on this one, of this cerebral spinal fluid. You also have your peripheral chemoreceptors, that's going to be in the carotid bodies or the aortic arch, and if you have an increase in hydrogen ion concentration, an increase in the partial pressure of CO2, what happens is the afferent signals from the peripheral chemoreceptors go to the dorsal respiratory group. So we are looking at these receptors going to your dorsal respiratory group, or we have your chemoreceptors in the dorsal respiratory group already sensitive for the hydrogen ion concentration in the cerebrospinal fluid. And if you have elevated hydrogen ion or partial pressure or CO2, that sends a signal from your dorsal respiratory group to the ventral respiratory group. The ventral respiratory group then sends efferent impulses down the phrenic nerve, down the intercostal muscles or intercostal nerves going to the accessory muscles, and then that increases the rate and depth. Now, if you have a decrease in hydrogen ion or you have a decrease in partial pressure of CO2, you have less afferent signals going this way. So there's less of those signals, which then tells the chemoreceptors or the dorsal respiratory group to then inhibit or slow down the ventral respiratory group, which then slows this down. Okay, so that will decrease your rate, decrease the depth. So if we send more down those nerves, we're increasing the rate and depth. If we're sending less down this direction, we are decreasing those. Now, the other portions that control respiratory rate and depth, these are chemoreceptors. These are your primary receptors and reflexes that control it. But you also have other receptors that can control breathing, such as proprioceptors, baroreceptors. You can have receptors, they're irritant receptors, receptors in your nose, your back of your throat. Have you ever had to clear your throat? Okay. Or cough because there was kind of something in your throat. Those are irritant receptors. You can have receptors associated with higher brain functions. If you're scared, that alters your breathing. So now you're looking at your limbic system that you're pulling into this. So emotions can cause it. Your prefrontal cortex, hypothalamus can alter. So there's many more areas of your brain that can control your breathing pattern as well, though we focus primarily on the chemoreceptors. I know this was a little bit confusing because I'm just throwing out initials and this kind of stuff. Rewind this video, play it again, open up your book, and then follow along on this picture so you can see kind of what's going on and just kind of trace it through, and you'll be okay. So that's it for this one. Next one, I think we're going to do, I don't know, something else. Thanks.